everyone. Welcome. My name is Virginia Hines. I'm a resident of Concord, a member of ConcordSafeTechnology, whose members are hosting this forum and whose mission is to educate citizens about the risks associated with wireless technology and advocate for safe solutions. I am also a director of the EMR Network, one of the sponsors of this forum, a national nonprofit organization whose mission includes educating the public about the biological impacts of human-made radiation and supporting local groups with a similar mission. I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone here to what I believe will be a good opportunity to learn about the impact that wireless technology is having upon our biological selves, our privacy, our data security, climate change, and our living planet. This afternoon, you will learn about the radiation burden that you and your children carry each day when exposed to wireless meters, Wi-Fi, cell phone antennas, and handheld wireless devices. You will learn about the impact of fifth-generation wireless and the Internet of Things technologies. We are privileged to have with us today a panel of 6 national experts in the field of clinical medicine, public health, engineering, education, and telecommunications, who will present research related to the nature and impacts of such wireless technologies. Our speakers will also share information about practices which provide safe alternatives to wireless. Here in Concord, Massachusetts, our town boards have worked with citizens since 1998 to understand wireless technology and cite that technology in the least intrusive and most protective way possible, as allowed by the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996. In Concord, we stand on hallowed ground for many reasons. Because our forebears dared to stand up to tyranny in the 18th century, which led to our liberation from King George. In the 19th century, Concord gave birth to a movement of thinkers, the Transcendentalists, who encouraged their neighbors to be self-reliant and to reason for themselves. One of the most prominent, Ralph Waldo Emerson, encouraged us to understand our world for ourselves, writing in his essay, Self-Reliance, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind." Henry David Thoreau did not simply live in Concord, although he did live simply. He considered himself a citizen of the world. In his seminal book, Walden, Thoreau wrote, "Let us settle ourselves and work and wedge our feet downwards through the mud and slush of opinion and tradition and pride and prejudice, appearances and delusion, through the alluvium which covers the globe, through poetry and philosophy and religion, through church and state, through Paris and London, through New York and Boston and Concord, till we come to a hard rock bottom that rocks in place we can call reality and say, this is and no mistake." By using our own minds to research and understand wireless technology, including the science, the clinical implications, the planetary and climate consequences, and to question whether our federal agencies are adequately regulating the telecommunications industry, we can work together to find solutions that will go a long way to creating a sustainable future for our children and generations to come. Finally, let us remember that Concord means a state of agreement and harmony. It is also defined as a simultaneous occurrence of 2 or more musical tones that produces an impression of agreeableness or resolution on a listener. Because we all have different training, professional experience, and backgrounds, and perhaps receive our information from different sources, we will probably not resolve all of our questions today. What is important, I believe, is that we be agreeable to listen with open minds and move forward as a community and a greater community to create solutions. Thank you. A few housekeeping items. We will have a 15-minute break in the middle of the forum. The bathrooms are clearly marked and there's water available. You'll see a sign when you come in or when you came in from the main entrance where the bathrooms are. During the question and answer section of the program, you're welcome to come up to the microphone and ask questions of the speakers. You can also write your question down on the 3x5 card at your place, and those cards will be collected, and I will ask your questions of the presenters. Again, welcome to our forum. So to begin, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Carl Merritt. Dr. Merritt is the president of Dove Health Alliance, a researcher in electromagnetic fields and energy medicine, and former researcher in electromagnetic fields in the Canadian military. Dr. Merritt is also a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy. Dr. Merritt will present the biological and health effects of both natural electromagnetic waves innate to the body and man-made electromagnetic waves from wireless technologies, including discussing about 4G, 5G antenna densification. He will describe the current health challenges of non-thermal electromagnetic fields, the proposed mechanisms of their biological effects, including the effects on body water. We will learn how wireless radiation has been leading to increasing levels of neurodegeneration in our population and why new safety guidelines must be implemented. Welcome, Dr. Merritt.
Another housekeeping item I've been asked to announce, and I think it's a good idea if you would turn off your wireless devices. Put them in airplane mode, please. There may be some electrically sensitive people here in the audience. Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you here today. I came yesterday from California, and it's warmer here than in California, so felt very much at home. My email was there in case you want to contact me, and I'm going to try to go fairly quickly. I'll also make the PDFs of this talk available so that you can watch them at your own pace later on. That way, as I speak fairly quickly about a lot of things in the short time I have, you'll get some idea about it. Well, we've known about electromagnetic problems really since the 60s. Alan Frey found that there was an effect called microwave hearing at non-thermal levels. You could actually hear sounds inside your head in the temporal cortex. He also found out that this radiation can affect the barrier that protects the brain, called the blood-brain barrier. We've known in the military about this since the 60s and 70s, and I'll show you how many studies are available about all of that. And the Bioinitiative Group, which is listed the website below, they've been compiling over 2,000 papers on this that are still contested in the general community, largely because there's a big influence from the telecommunication industry. Since 2011, we also have classified radio frequency radiation as a possible carcinogen. Now, this debate started with Alan Frey, who was really saying non-thermal radiation has an effect, compared to Herbert Schwann, who basically said it's only a thermal effect, a heating of the tissue we have to be worried about. And this is written about in Senek's book called The Microwave Debate. And they also talked about how the Russians at that time had used microwave radiation on the embassy personnel of the US Embassy in Moscow. And if I have time, I'll mention that at the end some more. So the military compiled all of this for the Naval Medical Research Institute, over 2,300 references of the effect of microwaves. The Army similarly, and the Defense Intelligence Agency in '76. So we've known about these things. And technology has evolved from 1G, which was more analog, the old brick phones, to 2G, which allowed you to have flip phones and the old Nokia phones and so on that you could text with. Then it went to browsing and the internet under 3G, which was more broadband, and now it's advancing and rolling out to 4G, which is basically what's being rolled out right now, except with a lot more antennas. 5G isn't really here yet. It's still coming, although it's being really pushed by the FCC, by the current administration, and of course the industry, because there's a lot of money to be made. But 5G is going to bring the Internet of Things around, which is basically technology to connect all the machines together. None of these have been studied yet for health effects. So the German company Rode and Schwarz saw this evolution for a long time, and they said 5G, when it comes about, is not just another generation, it's actually a paradigm change. And I want to share with you what that means today. Of course, there's big money to be made in this. Ericsson, one of the telecom companies from Sweden, forecast that in 2024, 45% of the global population will be covered by 5G, and that has a lot of implications. There'll be millions of billions of mobile subscriptions, and 5G is really being pushed right now, even though it's not even fully here yet. Qualcomm recently predicted at the consumer show in Las Vegas that there's going to be 200 million 5G smartphones sold this year. That's 4 times as much as Ericsson predicted in the 2018 report. So they're really pushing this hard. Insurance companies don't really insure telecom companies for health risks. They know there's a problem. They won't admit to the problem, and they can't have insurance for if they do any damage. You can even see this in here in the SEC filing from Verizon, that the business faces personal injury and consumer class action lawsuits relating to health effects. And so they're basically factoring that in, that sooner or later this might come about. So just a few days ago, the Senate passed the DIGIT Act, that stands for Developing Innovation and Growing Internet of Things, or DIGIT. They say that by 2030, there'll be 125 trillion IoT and other devices under 5G on the planet. That's in 10 years, ladies and gentlemen. So if we look at how the power levels have increased over time, you can see in the 50s in yellow, there wasn't that much radiation. In the 80s, it really picked up. Then we rolled out the internet antennas. By 2010, we are reaching the safety guidelines, and that's just for heating effects. Professor Pilla, who wrote articles in this book that's a standard textbook in medicine, he said, that it isn't just the tissue heating effects we should be concerned about. He said the evidence for weak non-thermal electromagnetic fields effect has become overwhelming. Now, this still isn't accepted generally, and there's a lot of requirements for more research, and we certainly should do that, but we should start to be aware of that. The industry, when it studies, 2/3 of the time says there are no harmful effects, and when you do independent research, 70% of the time, it says there are harmful effects. So there's a real bias in the literature. Now, most of you are probably going to be mostly exposed by near-field devices. These are your cell phones, your cordless phones. We measure that in the amount of radiation you absorb, or the specific absorption rate. Contrast that to far-field devices like antenna systems, like from cell towers, from Wi-Fi in your home, from the smart meters that are wirelessly transmitting, and from the satellites that are being launched right now as part of the new program. So in far field, we measure the power density, how many milliwatts per square meter are floating through the environment. In the near field, we measure the absorption by the tissues, because it has to be studied differently. And the exposures are only for short-term exposures, 6 and 30 minutes, respectively. So as a result of that, we don't really have any guidelines for long-term safety, and we're all being exposed to long-term effects. Now, later on, you'll hear from Deborah Davis at the end of the program. She's really a specialist in cell phone radiation, so I won't say too much about it, but you have to remember your cell phones have nowadays at least 4 different antenna systems in them. These antennas, when women carry them in their breasts, young women are showing up with breast cancer right where the antennas are if they keep them in their bra, which is not a good idea. So you really want to be aware of that. Now, what are we doing to our children is a big question. This is the percentage use of children in this country. 3/4 of all kids have cell phones, and many of them smartphones. It's lower in Europe, as you can see on the lower curve. And when do they get them? They start getting them as early as age 7, and only by age 16, there's only 10% of the kids who don't have cell phones yet. And they, of course, don't know the dangers of them, and they use them all the time, sleep with them, and so forth. And this is a real health hazard. Now, children have thinner brains, and their brains are growing, and they're still having a lot of neural connections being made. A 5-year-old child absorbs 2.5 more radiation than an adult, and our standards are made for a military male that's 200 pounds, has a thick skull. So our standards are way too high. Now look at the millennials. These are the ones born between 81 and 96. 66 of them live in a totally wireless homes. 83% of them sleep with their cell phones next to them. Okay, and then you ask, what's the health of these kids? You know, Blue Cross and Blue Shield studied 55 million Americans that are insured of the 73 million American millennials. And here we are seeing at age 27, their health starts to rapidly decline with diabetes, major depression, hyperactivity, and so forth. And they're, of course, really worried about it because these diseases used to happen in your 50s. This new generation is called iGen. They spend 4.5 hours a day on their devices, checking social media every 15 minutes, and there's a 60-minute expose from 2018 in December that you can watch. They say that kids who use them for up to 7 hours a day, their brains are shrinking, the cortex is getting smaller like Alzheimer's patients, and these are our future, ladies and gentlemen. So we're worried about that. Nicholas Kardaras talks about, he's a teen addiction specialist. You can see his website there, drkardaras.com. He recently spoke in San Francisco as well, and he said, look, kids are really addicted to social media, video games, of course, increase dopamine, and as much as sex does, so these people are playing games. They're not having sex so much, as it turns out. There's matter showing, this gray matter shrinkage. What are we seeing in the hospitals now? We're seeing increase in suicide rates. This is between 2007 and 2015. There's twice as much emergency room admissions of kids for suicide attempts or suicide ideation. And just this year, more Americans are spending time on their devices than on TV. So we now have reached an inflection point. Now, I don't want to say too much about cell phones because we'll hear more about that later, but most of the radiation is on the prefrontal cortex, on the frontal lobe, on the temporal lobe on the side. That's where most of the radiation is absorbed. And when we look at brain tumors, like this study from the UK, you see a lot more absorption in the red line in the frontal and temporal lobes and less in the rest of the brain region. So when we talk about there hasn't been a big increase in brain cancer, you really have to look at which lobes have been affected. There actually has been a tremendous increase. The US government and National Toxicology Program studied rats and mice and definitely said there's clear evidence that mobile phones that these rats and mice were exposed to are cancers of the heart, schwannomas that are fairly rare, cancer of the brain, the adrenal glands. So this was the largest study ever done by the US government. Cancer also can be affecting from radiation the parotid glands, the glands in your cheeks. Oops. Sorry, we seem to have lost this. Okay, we're back. Cancers in the cheek, thyroid gland cancers, and breast cancers in women that have the cell phone in their bras and so on. But if you look at other ones, cancers of the brain are still fairly rare, but pituitary gland tumors have gone up from 1998 to 2012, and this is already old data, threefold, okay? And if we look at where these tumors occur, they occur, of course, in older people, but you can see each of these curves in different colors show the rise to the 2008-2012. And I haven't really updated this, but we are seeing more pituitary tumors. And these devices pulse all the time, as you can see with that graph here. And it's this pulsing that causes the problem. It's not just the carrier wave. But so most people don't know if they use a cordless phone that the base station, even when you're not using it, is always pulsing. It's like Wi-Fi in your house. So we're now looking for smart cities, smart houses. Everything will be wireless. And as a result of that, there's 136 studies here that show, various effects. It's hard to read, but I'll just mention some of them: the brain, the eyes, the neurons, pregnancy, big effects on fertility, on sleep, on cognitive processing, on neurobehavioral effects, on immune system function, and on and on. There are so many studies out there, but people are not paying attention to them. Here's an example where we see plants being affected. On the left is a control Parsley plant, and then on the middle is a 2G phone affecting plant cell formation. On the right is Wi-Fi effect on plant growth. This is inside the actual plants that we live on. And we're starting to see antibiotic resistance now when we use Wi-Fi in your house all the time. So I suggest at least you turn it off at night when you want to heal your body. Now, I'm here to talk mostly about more cell towers and 5G, because that's what's on the map. Here's a map of the cell towers. Of course, it's where we need to be in communication, so they've put them everywhere. And there's about, anywhere from 117,000 of them. But if you live in close proximity to them, within 300 meters or 900 feet or so, people are more prone to headaches, lack of concentration, memory loss, irritability, depression, insomnia, fatigue, loss of libido. And if you go to a doctor and you say you have these things, there can be many causes for that. And the doctors really aren't trained. I happen to be trained being an engineer before I did my medical training. So you can see here by the bars, closest are the highest, symptom being reported. So in red here, you see what's highest is fatigue, headaches, difficulty concentration, memory loss. I can't tell you how many people I'm seeing in the last while, even young people, have said they really have trouble remembering and having trouble sleeping and having trouble with having energy and motivation and so forth. And there's a video here that you can see on YouTube. There's two cell towers. They're only 40 feet apart, and the bees are dropping, just dying and falling to the ground right between these things. Very interesting video to watch. Then we've had smart meters. The smart meters have been installed in order to wirelessly transmit the data of your utility usage. That could happen just as easily with wired connections, with fiber optics, but they've elected not to do that. And here is what people report from symptoms from 2013, 210 questionnaires. Again, people can't sleep, have ringing in the ears, pressure in their head, difficulty concentrating, headaches, and on and on. 75% of these were women, 25% men. But it's not just in the US, in all the states, but they also studied it in Canada and Australia. And this study that was published in Alternative Therapies and Health and Medicine was a survey of 142 people in Australia. After the smart meter was put in, they had insomnia, headaches, ringing in the ears, fatigue, cognitive disturbances, the same kind of pattern. So we're basically heard from Mr. Wheeler, Tom Wheeler, who was a former industry lobbyist, groomed for the job, then put in as head of the FCC. And in 2016, he said, look, this is damn important. We have to get 5G, and we're going to give the telecom industry free rein how to make this happen. And he said, sorry, I don't know why this keeps stopping me off. He said that we need 800,000 small antenna systems 5G in by 2025. Now, just to put that in perspective, compared to what we have now, that's 6 times more antennas about to be rolled out in the next 5 years, okay? And these are small distributed antenna systems that are fit on lampposts and so forth. Now, the FCC, as Harvard Center for Ethics has shown, is a captured agency. It's beholden to the industry to a large degree in its regulatory rulings. And if we start looking at how this is going to look in the future, these colored dots on the bottom there would be all the cell towers from all the different carriers that are on the different utility poles, as often as every 300 feet. Okay, and this is what they kind of look like. You can see them on various utility posts, lamp posts, and so on. Here's one outside of a bedroom in San Francisco. Now, you're going to have this 24/7 radiating into your bedrooms. And they can, here's some on the top there, you can see several utility poles, certainly several per block, will be installed. And they have lithium batteries on the curbside. If a truck runs into them, they could explode. You know about lithium batteries being flammable if they short circuit and so forth. So in California and Huntington Beach, they plan to put in these new fusion poles. You won't even recognize them. They're 5G. Okay, the base in the bottom and the antennas are near the top. So what's really here right now is what we call long-term evolution, or 4G, which is now called Advanced Pro, and it's a stepping stone. What's being installed right now is 4G antennas that will have some of the characteristics, but not all of 5G. And the key elements of 5G is that they'll have antennas that have multiple antenna systems that can shape a beam so it can directly go to your cell phone, your IoT device, in order to be acting somewhat like a laser beam. It uses what's called phased arrays that can steer the beam. This is the very thing we did in radar technology, steering a beam directly to a target. And you will be carrying your phone. You'll be always in contact with your phone. The phone will give you better reception, but the health effects of that are perhaps very significantly increased because you're going to be using a very bundled beam going in your direction, and it'll start using higher frequencies. Now, this higher frequency spectrum is called the high band, and it'll be, right now, most of our cell phones communicate, well, some of 5G goes down to 600 megahertz, which they're using that part of the spectrum that the TV's channels gave up. But now we're going to go up to type of millimeter waves, very small, fraction of an inch, that will directly interact with your subtle body, with your acupuncture meridians, potentially, with your sweat glands and so forth. And they've released these in 2016, and they're assigning all these frequencies in auctions to the different carriers up to 71 gigahertz. And this is unstudied, and it ought to be studied before it's released. Now, the difference between, say, 4G at a lower frequency that we currently use is that 5G has a much smaller wavelength, as you can see on the bottom picture, and so it gets reflected from buildings, it gets reflected from foliage, from trees, and so forth. So therefore, we need a lot more antennas to keep the coverage intact. And as I said, it may interact with your body in unexpected ways. These active phased array antennas, as you can see in the picture on the right, the signal won't just go out omnidirectionally in all directions equally and decreasing with the square of the distance as it normally does. They'll be actually bundled and keep the cell phone signal very strong towards your device. And as you walk around, you'll be tracking. But as you can see, what these things look like, these are these new 5-antenna systems in Oregon. One company is called RADWIN. They call it jet beamforming technology. They haven't studied any of the health effects of this, but this is what it looks like. A beam is sent in blue to the target. That beam has a central lobe, as you can see, the longest on the bottom right there, the longest lobe, but it has side lobes, as this kind of technology does, and those will radiate in specific directions to the people who are standing there. Anyway, you can watch this. The idea for that is a great engineering idea. From a health perspective, I'm very much concerned that this may lead to long-term imbalances that we've already seen. And then Elon Musk, with the Starlink system, is launching satellites. We've launched 180 satellites, the last one just last week, last 60. They hope to launch a total of up to 42,000 satellites for 5G. They'll use the same technology beaming down on Earth, and Amazon is getting into the game frame and OneWeb. So we're going to be surrounded by satellites beaming 5G signals down wherever you go in this country. And there'll be ones in embedded roadways, 5G. This is a British company called Valorant, so that, you know, your smart cars can stay. So whenever you drive along, you'll be irradiated from all directions. Now, there was a paper in Health Physics in 2018 that actually, and these are the biophysicists that look at this, and they said, look, this 5G will be transmitted like all radiation in bursts, but it's so bundled and strong that it may lead to a much higher peak to average ratio of almost 1,000 times more. And these peaks, you know, these sudden transitions is what's biologically, it's not just the carrier wave and the averaging. And this is a real problem, and they suggest we might want to revisit our guidelines. And this is from Health Physics. So you have to start thinking of this stuff like laser beams going out in the future. These will interact with tissue in a whole different way. And they haven't really studied the health effects at all. And these RF exposure guidelines, you know, that we have are probably not really effective at all for that. So they're outdated. They haven't been revised since 1996. We have, at that time, we had a much lower radiation level. We ought to be looking at this because other countries like Russia and China and Switzerland and Belgium, they have 100 times lower exposure limits than we have, and they have not allowed this to be rolled out. So here's on the left what our thermal guidelines are if you plotted it linearly, and you can see a very high graph, and then down below are much lower levels that are recommended for safety, and you see they're 1,000,000 times lower. But even if we lowered it 100, 1,000 times lower, we would really protect our population. So when the government, through Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, asked, you know, the industry, what studies have you done before you rolled all this out? They said absolutely none. So he said, we're essentially flying blind here in health and safety, aren't we? And that's exactly the condition today. And scientists have warned, you know, and said, look, slow this down. Let's study this first. The studies can't keep up as fast as the technology is being rolled out. So the scientists are always behind the curve trying to do the latest thing. And 5G hasn't even fully been implemented, or the guidelines haven't even been set for it. But 261 scientists from 41 countries said, look, we have to change this and use the precautionary principle. It's unethical to ignore the available evidence, is what the doctors for the environment already said. So Belgium slowed it down because they said it's too high. Now, what part of your body gets hit, especially the brain, the eyes, the thyroid, the heart can be affected, the reproductive system, oxidative stress in the body is a very common effect of this. There can be DNA damage in single and double strand breaks. There can be interruptions to the normal programmed cell death called apoptosis, and ultimately there are many studies showing with cancer. But what really concerns me is the amount of neurodegeneration, how the minds are being affected. This is a study for over a 20-year period to 2010. That's already 10 years old. Now, and women over 75 have almost 6 times as much neurodegeneration that they're dying from. In men, it's almost 3 times as much. So we have unprecedented levels of neurological disease in older people now. And especially what's affecting it is the mitochondria. These are the energy-producing parts of your body. And these illnesses include Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism and panic disorder and major depressive episodes and so on. And if we just look at where neurological death is occurring on the planet, you can see all the industrialized countries in red here, where all the cell phones are being used, you know, are the primary being affected. And in fire stations, you know, when California tried to pass a bill in 2017 called SB 649 that Governor Brown vetoed after we sent out a lot of reports that this could be damaging to slow down the rollout of this 5G. fire stations were already exempted from this because people or firemen and people living in firehouses that had antennas on top of them, they all had problems answering 911 calls. And when Gunnar Heuser, a doctor at the UCLA Brain Research Institute, studied these people, you could see they had problems in their brain with functional MRIs, and he called that toxic encephalopathy. Now, these people lived right under a cell tower. So some of the biological effects include things like oxidative stress, mitochondrial damage, membrane leakage. The cells are stressed with heat shock proteins. There's DNA damage and calcium channels. And that's because we have biological windows that Russ Adey already discovered in the 80s. And these don't require high-intensity radiation in order to trigger them. Low levels at the right frequency and the right patterning would be the effect. So there is oxidative stress, which is like essentially free radicals, which cause a form of, you could think of it as rusting, because rust is an oxidative stress of iron, as it were. And the studies are really quite conclusive how big an issue it is. And I'm sure we'll hear more from Dr. Huro about that as well. Mitochondria are the power plants of the cell, and they're especially important in the brain and the heart, and this is what gets affected. So here you can see oxidative stress, fatigue, headaches, sleep disturbances, low amounts of melatonin produced in the brain, some studies, neurobehavioral effects, memory issues, reproductive effects. I want to just give you an overview of what's involved here, okay? And we also have crystals in the brain that are called magnetite. There's 5 million crystals in every gram of brain tissue, 100 million crystals in the covering of the brain, the meninges. And so these directly resonate to EMF. That may be another mechanism. Martin Paul has suggested it happens through voltage-gated calcium channels. We have these in all the cells of our body, but especially the brain. And calcium is a trigger for the cells, especially the neurons, to fire and so forth. So when we interrupt these, then we have a major interruption of brain processing. Now, a lot of people are becoming electrically hypersensitive. It's estimated between 3 and 8% of the general population, but maybe a third of the population is already moderately sensitive without knowing. They have these symptoms, but they're not aware that this might be caused by electromagnetic radiation. And they complain of the very same things I talked about before: fatigue, headaches, depression, memory loss, nausea, sleep disturbances, sort of vague symptoms. But I have many clients who had to leave Silicon Valley because they're electrically sensitive and can't live there anymore. And I just want to say one or two words about water. Maybe you can answer more questions about it. But, you know, water absorbs electromagnetic radiation. It's in our atmosphere, of course. It's in our bodies. 99% of all the molecules in our body are water molecules. We're 70% water by volume. And so 5G is basically affecting that, but it's happening through quantum physical process, through what we call biological coherence of the water molecules inside the cells. When we looked at how electromagnetic radiation is affecting water, you can see when you crystallize water, then it has this sort of hexagonal, snowflake-like 60-degree branching structure. But when you take water from a water tower that has a cell phone mast on it, the crystallization pattern is totally disturbed. Now, these are more energetic ways of looking at water, not just chemical analysis. And we're now in the age that is called the age of surveillance capitalism. If you haven't heard of this, I suggest you look at Shoshana Zuboff's book from Harvard. This is what's driving this. Big data is leading to more and more surveillance. And the military has not been short of saying, I think this is great for us. Maybe we can see, you can download this report from the Department of Defense, and they said, look, 5G technology has a great opportunity for us. It's benefits for our operational requirements, because they say it'll play an essential role in hypersonic weapons, missiles, including those from nuclear warheads, which travel at 5 times the speed of sound. That's where you need very fast communication. So it's in some ways also military technology. And finally, I just want to show you there is now patents showing that you can actually create hearing with microwaves directly beaming audio or other information into your brain. And this was part of what we call the embassy attack of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba that was reported in the New York Times in 2018. And this person at UCSD is called Beatrice Golem. She said, look, all of the symptoms that these people had, and that's why we closed the U.S. Embassy in Havana, is because this is all microwave-related issues. So Rudolf Steiner, who some of you may know about, started Waldorf education and other things, said, this life of men in the midst of electricity, notably radiant electricity, will presently affect them in such a way they will no longer be able to understand the news which they receive so rapidly. The effects is to damp down their intelligence. And this was said in 1923. So I think we have a real challenge ahead of us, and I hope we take some of these steps to don't upgrade to a 5G phone, turn them off, get rid of your cordless phones, or at least unplug the base station. Only use your routers when you really need them, and try to replace, if you can in your state, the smart meter with analog meters. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Paul Héroux, an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics, and Occupational Health at McGill University School of Medicine, Canada, where he is the current Occupational Health Program Director. Dr. Héroux is a scientist with experience in physics, engineering, and health sciences. The title of Dr. Héroux's talk is Health Perturbations of Wi-Fi Radiation in Schools and Homes. He will speak about the pulse nature of Wi-Fi radiation and the two main impacts presently recognized in children, namely cancer and effects on the nervous system. He will also discuss the numerous observations on memory, behavior, and attention that have been made. Welcome, Dr. Héroux.
Thank you very much. So Dr. Merritt referred to my research on essentially magnetic fields in your environment being a more deleterious agent than oxygen, but actually I will not speak about this, essentially because I was asked to speak about other things, and I will stick to what I was asked to do. So I talk about irradiation from Wi-Fi in schools and the possible consequences that this might have, as well as to why the Federal Communications Commission, this is your commission, does not protect you. How all of this happened? Well, the second question is actually easier to understand. So, why the FCC does not protect you? Why could that be? Isn't that their function? But actually, it's a spectrum allocation agency. They don't have any health specialists. And it all has to do with this. You might recognize this as an atomic bomb. And to understand how we got to where we are today, you have to have the perspective of history. Some will tell you that the present limits for electromagnetic radiation are based on heat. But actually, heat is a placeholder for war. At the time that the limits were set, the Cold War was in play. The Soviets had just launched Sputnik, and mention of health effects of electromagnetic radiation in your country was widely viewed as anti-patriotic in view of the desire to prevail over the Soviets. The motives were very, very important. War critically depends on radar and communications. You don't lose war because your army has too many cancers. You lose wars for other reasons. If you don't believe that this is true, I submit to you this slide. This is the committee that set the ball rolling for industry in 1966. The standard was decided by a committee of 15 people. 10 were from the Armed Services, 1 from the Petroleum Institute, 1 from Space Administration, 1 from General Dynamics, who makes fighters, 1 from the US Treasury, and 1 from the US Public Health Service, probably very carefully chosen. So this bias is maintained until today in the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which is a self-appointed body in Germany that manages itself, and the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. So the real philosophical question is, are the exposures that are appropriate for a fighter pilot in his F-16 who intuitively accepts risk, he is in the military, appropriate for your daughter in school, in the first grade, under a Wi-Fi router? And at the time, this wasn't a question, because in 1966, these situations did not exist. The next question is, if the military could, for political and war reasons, obtain a very high standard so as not to impair their function, could industry perhaps get the same deal? Is not industry as important as war? What do you say? Economic development is very, very important, isn't it? So what place do we want to give to this as compared to health? So at the top you see here a logo from the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And they have a dream of unlimited applications for telecommunications because they see this as a tremendous service to humanity. Their dream is based on the proliferation of semiconductors and radio frequency devices. They have no specific dreams for humans, but they have specific dreams for their own industry. They impose their own ideas about health impacts, specifically the thermal ideas. And as far as the health impacts, it's a subject that they did not really understand or care very much to understand. You have to understand that from within industry, they are totally devoted to their craft. And things outside are beyond what they can afford to be preoccupied with. And you see the curve here that shows below that recently, a few years ago, we were spending 202 hours and 51 minutes on cell phones. So this is not 1966 anymore. Due to evolution in technology, we have widespread, considerably exposure to radio frequencies. In 1966, it was mostly a military exposure. Now it's your exposure. So, essentially what happened over time is that, yes, industry felt, well, the military got this deal, can we get the same deal? And from the military to the American National Standards Institute, which is an organization of engineering firms, to the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, to the Federal Communications Commission, the standard for exposure originating in the military was transmitted almost unchanged. So, what can we make of this? This is not an old story. This is a new story, sorry. It is a very, very old one. You know that guy? He is the priest of capitalism, the one who determined that let industry go and let industry flourish. It will be best for all of us. And we know that we need a flourishing industry. But do we need to leave industry to do whatever it wants? If you see at the top there, you'll see that industry wants to widen the market. And that industry is focused on itself. That's what we, as shareholders, ask them to do. So they're just doing what is expected of them. But it comes from an order of men whose interests are not exactly the same as those of the population. They aim to sell products. So, merchants and the engineering community are not busy defending your health in spite of their public relations, comments. They are completely focused on expanding their business. And Adam Smith told us, never let the merchants make the rules. But I would call the IEEE and the FCC the merchants in this case. We've been through things like that before. And apparently we don't learn very, very well from this situation. So the first on the left here is a Bobby in London. Well, for a long time, there were very few smokestacks in our environment, so dilution of industrial contaminants was great. So there was no impact on us. But in 1952, there was the killer fog in London where 12,000 people died within 4 days. And that awakened people to the idea that perhaps all of this trash in our air is not very good for us. And since then, we have expanded on this knowledge to know that, yes, it is very, very bad for us to broadcast trash in our air. Okay, you've heard about lead. Well, General Motors' policy in 1921 of supporting the inclusion of tetraethyl lead in gasoline instead of ethanol. As a result, 15 million of your children lost about 10 IQ points. Will this corporation ever be held accountable for this? No. At that point, they must have known. They knew that this was going to happen, but ethanol was not patentable. The victims are your children. So, should we have introduced ethanol in 1921? I believe so, and I believe that General Motors would still be flourishing right now had it done so. I have a GM car. I love it. There's more than one way to develop things. So these children have permanent losses in IQ. They have hyperactivity, behavior, and learning problems that will not go away ever. So many substances have heavy public health impacts that rarely show acute evidence of toxicity at low levels. Otherwise, they would be classified as poisons. Just like global warming, global microwaving, which is about to happen to you, and obligatory global microwaving, because it's going to be in front of your house, is happening. So, exposure to electromagnetic radiation of all sorts have been happening over the last 100 years. And with the pulse electromagnetic radiation that you've had since the second generation of cell phones, the effects on you have increased. However, I would say that they have been present since about 1900. And so we are dealing with a real problem that in 1920 did not have the means to acknowledge, but that we can measure now. Turning back to the second question, Wi-Fi in schools, libraries, and our homes, where do our children go to be safe? So, in classrooms, in libraries, in administrative offices, isn't it convenient to install a router and to get Wi-Fi? And like any marketed device, wireless has been promoted as the wondrous new tool of education. It will make your kids smarter, faster, with less cost. But this was not demonstrated because this was introduced. It was accepted because you all like to have new tide and something new to be purchased. We are programmed by our television, by publicity, to accept innovation as positive without having it, I would say, vetted beforehand. So, what is the situation in schools? Well, all of these locations can be potentially filled with electromagnetic radiation. And in fact, the radiation in schools can be so strong that in some cases it will approach the FCC thermal limit. Why is this? Well, this is taken from the website of a company who promotes installations in schools, and what they say is that, well, the solution must support relatively high numbers of connections, typically 30 computers in a classroom, communicating, say, with one Wi-Fi router. And in addition, if you want to use these XO laptops, they have a collaboration capability with their little ears that you see there, where they will not only communicate with the router, they will communicate with each other. And they have a capacity for as many as 99 others to communicate with. So it's not really a surprise that, and also it is suggested here that if this isn't enough for your class or fast enough, we can put more routers in a single class. So I have not measured this personally, but some people have, and they say the FCC limit is practically reached. And this is the thermal limit that says that essentially heating is a problem, not to speak of all the other problems. So, under these circumstances, what can we make of Wi-Fi in schools? For children, it is clear to me that if radiation is a risk, and if you think of these extreme configurations, you can't accept to have it. You would wire all schools. But I am a university professor. I teach graduate students. So what do I think of this situation, Wi-Fi in schools personally? In my class, we have Wi-Fi. So I go in front of an audience, and they all have computers. I can no longer be certain of their attention. Classrooms were meant to keep people together on a single subject that was brought to them by a teacher. I thought that was the case. I don't teach students in an amusement park, but having Wi-Fi in class makes this entirely possible. This is the first effect that is deleterious. I spend most of my time wondering whether I'm entertaining enough for the students in front of me. Secondly, the internet in class, it does one thing that's very critical. It cheapens knowledge because you can input a few words and you've got information immediately. So what this does is that since there is no problem with accessing information, why do I need to acquire it? So internet makes it easier for students to look smart, but it makes it harder for them to be smart. And I think that's very important. So, what is the health evidence that this radiation actually does something to these kids? Well, it's time of exposure multiplied by the intensity of the exposure, multiplied by the susceptibility to damage. So one question is, are children more susceptible than adults? Maybe it's the case. Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2013 petitioned the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the Food and Drug Administration to reassess the safety of electromagnetic radiation, and they have refused openly to do so because they think everything is fine. Everything is fine for who is the question. So Dr. Moret has already shown something like this, that an adult has this kind of penetration, a 10-year-old child has this, and a 5-year-old child has that in terms of radiation exposure. So the criteria that are based on heat, this is an assessment of a cell phone here and the heat, and this is an assessment of penetration of albumin in the brain. Penetration of albumin in the brain is a symptom of brain pathology. The pattern of this and the pattern of this, you see here these dots, this is the control. This is the exposed. Dots show penetration of albumin. Here, this is the control. Again, dots that show penetration of albumin. The two patterns are entirely different. So what this says is that essentially, engineering studies cannot predict the risk to students. Thermal estimations cannot reach biological reality. And why are we worried about albumin going into the brains of students? Is because albumin, this huge molecule, can be a carrier for all of these toxicants. If your child has been exposed to these things at the same time as radiation, this stuff, arsenic, lead, benzene, will all go into their brains. Electrosensitive people, you know there are some in your community, but there's relatively few of them. Why would we care? It's their problem. They are the ones that are sick, aren't they? This is a young girl in Oregon who survived because she changed school after Dr. Paul Dart in Oregon found out that she was electrosensitive, and moving to a school without Wi-Fi solved her problem entirely. So, there's lots of studies on the effects of microwave radiation that are very, very convincing on learning and memory in the rat and changes in the hippocampus, the site of memory, oxidative stress, apoptosis, and energy metabolism. With 1 minute remaining, I will fly through these things. You see, maturation of neural cells is abnormal. You see, apoptosis, which means destruction of cells in the nervous system, is enhanced. Changes in the structure of the memory centers of the brain are there. And if that weren't enough, epidemiological studies say that it gives you headaches. Oh my God. So all the signs are there. We have a population of people who can't tolerate this radiation. It gives you headaches. And we have plenty of studies showing that it's deleterious. My colleague Anthony Miller is really worried that between 0 and 4 years old to 2010, we have an increase annually in tumors of the central nervous system and malignant brain tumors. So it's going up in your children. And altered gray matter volume and white matter integrity in cell phones. Okay, I'm going to go to my conclusion. This is the class that represents a bunch of students. You see they're in a wireless school, but I want to represent this as a group of studies. Now, one of these students is electrosensitive. One study says that this student has to go elsewhere to another school. These 3 students, they have memory impairment, they don't learn as well. Who will know about this? What industry is saying is that as long as all the studies don't concur to measure the same things, we shouldn't act. In other words, let's wait till they're all electrosensitive, all dumber, and maybe then we will have indexes that will detect this effect and will do something about it. And science is clear. There is no doubt about the deleterious effect of this radiation. It is being stopped by the foothold that industry has gained on regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haru. That was great. I'm now pleased to introduce Camilla Reese. Camilla is a communications strategist and award-winning health and environmental activist. She is the founder of electromagnetic.org and Manhattan Neighbors for Safe Telecommunications. She is a senior policy advisor at the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy. The title of Ms. Reese's talk is Facing Our Reality, Humanity at a Crossroads. Ms. Reese will explain the importance of people getting involved in and supporting activism by supporting public education, media understanding, and the legal recourse to assure a sustainable future. Welcome, Camilla.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Virginia. And greetings, everyone. It's really great to be here in Concord. For those of you who don't know me, I've been an activist on the subject of electromagnetic fields and also tech overuse and addiction for 12 years. And I speak to you today both from the perspective of somebody who has studied the science on this subject and the clinical ramifications for 12 years, but also as somebody who has been injured by electromagnetic fields. I deeply empathize with the people today who are hurting and on the periphery of society, unable to participate in the ways that we take for granted. People who can't take a job in a wireless environment, bright students who can't concentrate in schools using Wi-Fi or when they're doing their homework at home on a wireless connection, or people who can no longer socialize with friends like they used to because of the ever-present cell phones, Wi-Fi, and wireless infrastructure all around us, and people with chronic illnesses that never, ever recover because of this increasingly pervasive and little understood invisible stressor. I have a sense also of just how bad it's going to get for those who are already impacted by the present exposure levels. From the many millions more of these antennas if we allow the 4G and 5G antenna densification vision of the telecommunications industry to become reality. I'm talking about the debilitating symptoms that you've heard from the two prior speakers, things like impaired cognitive function, inability to focus, fatigue, sleep impairment, mood alterations, heart irregularities, anxiety and depression, and more. These are debilitating symptoms that an estimated 3 to 8% or 10 to 25 million people in the U.S. are already experiencing today in a serious way from Wi-Fi in our homes, neighborhoods, schools, offices. I'm also talking about the symptoms that over 100 million people, as one of the prior speakers mentioned, those who are mildly symptomatic, like people who might know that they get a headache from their cell phone. Mild, but usually worsening over time with time and with the addition of new sources of exposure. I have experienced many of these symptoms myself. I became debilitated 12 years ago when I was sleeping on the other side of the wall from a neighbor's wireless router. New neighbors moved in, they put the router on the other side of the wall from my pillow. And I was fortunate that I was able to figure it out when nobody really knew about this subject, and fortunately greatly recovered. It was a rude awakening to this issue because I had incorrectly assumed that if technologies were on the market, that someone had determined that they were safe. And it happened again more recently when a neighbor in another location, put in 2 wireless routers. And I had to completely shield one side of my premises with industrial quality aluminum and cover it with linen fabric. Not pretty, but it did the job. With the help of Dr. Merritt, actually, I was able to get it down to almost 0 from the frequencies that were in my place. Of course, we've heard today from Dr. Merritt and Haru that they're not only are they the acute symptoms, but that there are serious chronic effects from this radiation, including cancers, neurological, metabolic, reproductive, and microbiological effects. The evidence is plentiful and it's undeniable at this point. And so today on this program, I am giving voice to the people who have been injured because of society's negligence, and to those who most certainly will become injured on the present trajectory of more and more antennas in our midst. Outside in neighborhoods, on buildings, in our skies, with the launch of, now the number is 50,000 satellites going up that will transmit wireless from space, as well as antennas inside from the no value added, wholly unnecessary, I call it surveillance electronics network in development known as the Internet of Things. Even former CIA Director James Woolsey called this a stupid, stupid thing and said we're going to be spied on by our dishwasher. Tom Wheeler, let's see if we can make this work, who was the former chair of the FCC. We'll just listen to him for a few minutes.
If something can be connected, it will be connected in the 5G world. Hundreds of billions of microchips connected in products from pill bottles to plant waters, requiring massive deployment of small cells. We won't wait for the standard. Now, to make this work, the 5G build-out is going to be very infrastructure intensive. We must reject the notion that the 5G future will be the sole province of urban areas. The 5G revolution will touch all corners, and that's damn important.
So understand that what is unfolding with antennas everywhere, in what is unfolding everywhere, the human beings are just going to be a piece of a very large computer system, a vision that is that fundamentally devalues human beings and that reflects what I would call a fantasy of some very imbalanced people who are creating these technologies just because they can, not because they're meeting a market need. Now, for those of you who have no symptoms and think you're not being affected, this was a study done by Dr. Beverly Rubik. The first image is after a 20-minute baseline period. This is the thermography test. Then the second one is measuring the effects on the brain after 5 minutes, and then after 10 minutes when the temperature degree went up 3.9 degrees, so that's almost 4 degrees. And then here are some study done on red blood cells. First one is the baseline. The second one is the second one is after being held, a cell phone in a bag, in a backpack, not actually used against the head, where you see the cells starting to clump together. And the third one is after actively using the cell phone against the head. The blood cells are getting sticking together, creating a dangerous picture. And then she looked at, well, where is this happening? Is it happening at the extremities? So she tested the blood from the fingertips and from the toes, and look at how bad it is there. So we all are being affected, and Carl talked a little bit, Dr. Merritt talked a little bit about the cell towers, but I want to just point out a couple other things. But this is a study from Belo Horizonte, Brazil, that shows that there was a 35% increased death from cancer within 100 meters of a cell tower compared to those who lived over 1,000 meters. So here we're talking about putting in these antennas on utility poles, really steps from our bedroom. And it makes no sense. This is a good image from the movie Full Signal. If you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. In Yusfi, Israel, where a doctor got concerned because there were so many increased incidences of cancer, he plotted them out by their address, and it turned out that all the with one or two exceptions, all of the incidences were in the vicinity of where the antennas had gone up. Carl talked about the kind of effects we're seeing. I'll point out also, this was a study I was involved in, effects on the heart. In this study, 40% of the subjects showed heart irregularities after exposure to, it was a portable phone, but same frequency as Wi-Fi. This particular one, the heart rate almost doubled. So we have to remember that this radiation is biologically active. It is not static. And it's comprised of pulsing and peaks and different signaling characteristics and new signaling characteristics that are coming with the 5G as well. And we forget this, or maybe we were never taught it, but we really need to start focusing on it today. And beyond the fact that we're electromagnetic, we should, our brain, our heart, every single cell in our body runs on electrons. But beyond that, as Dr. Merritt said, we're also water. 99% of the molecules in our body are water. And so don't you believe when you hear that 5G is only going to affect us at the surface of the skin. This is entirely false. This is propaganda that was put out early in the propaganda on 5G to make us think that there wasn't a problem. It's actually affecting the water in our bodies, creating incoherence, and with many downstream biological effects. And I can tell you that telecom industry insiders looking at the effects on water are gravely concerned about 5G. Dr. Haru talked about the effects on children. This is a summary of some of the effects from a program that we did in Connecticut a few years ago. We are affecting children's ability to function and to learn and to discern and have healthy relationships, and we're setting them up for a lifetime of health problems on the trajectory that we're on. We're also seeing an increase in psychiatric disorders in children, psychotropic medication use, chronic medical conditions, and disability filings. And this is no surprise to the people who understand the science. Okay, I'll mention this study from Saudi Arabia. They did a study, there was a cell tower, 2 schools, one tower stronger than the other tower. Showed that the risk for increased hemoglobin A1C and type 2 diabetes was significantly greater in the school that had the higher power tower. And this is something we really need to pay attention to given the epidemic of diabetes today. And of course then there are the mental health problems from the technology that we see all around us beyond just the biological. See what's happening to the fabric of our society. We all see it. It's undeniable. And a big question is raised when we start to look at the amount of time that we actually spend online. Estimates are between 5 and some as high as 11 hours a day. So when you do the math, 5 hours a day times 365 days a year, that's 1,825 hours in the year. Now, if you assume that you sleep for 8 hours and you have 15 waking hours, that translates to 122 days online per year, which is a little over 4 months of our life. So we have to start asking if this is the reality that we want. Are we wanting to spend a third of our life online? Do we want our closest relationship to be with a machine and to be habituated to a dopaminergic stimulant? Or our lives sped up so that we miss a lot of what could be? Do we even realize just what we are giving up by spending many months of our life online? A big reason for why there are as many antennas out there as there are is because we are asking for them through our purchases of wireless and mobile technologies. Here's an example of the insanity. This is in Russia. They're putting wireless virtual reality headgear on the cow to give the cow a prettier picture than the location of the farm. And it's actually serving to reduce anxiety in the cows, and they're hoping that it will yield more milk. Now, it was really moving to me when I learned about the death of Carsten Schroeder, who was the CEO of Swisscom. Several years ago, he committed suicide. And just weeks before he committed suicide, he was interviewed by 2 media organizations. And in Reuters, he said, he described himself as a victim of modern communications, always on the go, and said it was too easy to get lost in the stream of information. And he said, I find it increasingly difficult to unwind. Well, you know what? Sometimes, even though I greatly limit my technology use, I find myself getting lost in the stream of information and missing the life that I would otherwise have. So today, we are at a crossroads. We are either going to go down this destructive trajectory that is going to greatly harm large numbers of people, as well as our genetic material, or we're going to do some truth-telling and demand change. Dr. Martin Pall has said we are harming the 4 things that matter to us most: our health, our brain function, the integrity of our genome, and our ability to produce healthy offspring. We have to face our reality, the name of this talk. We have to stop and see it in the whole picture. See what is happening to us, to our environment, to our lives, and see if we are truly in agreement with this mad rush to a surveillance society that all these antennas are facilitating. Antennas are going up everywhere, on utility poles, street signs, lamp posts, municipal infrastructure. Electronics in our homes have embedded antennas in them for the Internet of Things. Pervasive antennas leading to a surveillance society and a rogue surveillance capitalism that is not based on meeting a market's need. We have antennas using more and more dangerous higher frequencies and more complex signaling characteristics on which there has been no safety testing. We are dramatically increasing energy usage to power all of these antennas and the data centers, when faster, safer, and more energy efficient alternatives exist that you're going to hear about from Dr. Sheckley next. And we have technology becoming increasingly immersive with virtual reality, augmented reality, as well as invasive with implantable wireless technology and a long-term vision of the merging of man and machine. In addition, we're agreeing to the personal tech risks. We're agreeing to the programming that's designed to addict us. We know that. To the screen effects, like the lighting and the flicker and the effects on our eyes, that's well known. We're agreeing to being in an overstimulated state, to the immersive nature of these experiences and the blurring between reality and virtual reality. We're agreeing to the well-known multitasking and interactivity effects, risks related to the increasing speed of our lives due to tech, and risks simply to the duration of use, that the levels of that the 5 to 11 hours a day. So we're on a destructive antenna densification trajectory with a total lack of consciousness about the biological and health effects of radio frequency radiation and other technology risks. We're turning a blind eye to the loss of our privacy, to the environmental effects, to the uglification of America, to the energy utilization, to the effects on future generations, to the impacts of all of this on healthcare costs and the economy, and to the effects of radio frequency radiation on planetary communication systems by way of the water that Dr. Merritt described. It's programs like Today in Concord and this program that give me hope, if we can possibly play it. These were children in Ireland protesting recently. 6 counties in Ireland have banned 5G. So, as you've heard today, we have to face the reality that the U.S. government has known since at least the 1940s, if not earlier, that radio frequency radiation was dangerous, and yet has allowed a multi-trillion-dollar industry to emerge. They've allowed the FCC to use fraudulent safety guidelines that only protect against the heating effects, but yet they know that the radiation is linked to cancers, neurological problems, all kinds of problems. Our government knows this, and yet they have been providing cover to the telecom industry by allowing them to get away with these inadequate FCC guidelines. Actually, let me see if I can go back. So 49 years ago, in 1971, the Naval Medical Research Institute report showed effects. In 1981, NASA report. In 1993, an FDA internal memo showed that admitted that microwaves accelerate cancer. In 2002, an EPA letter affirms that the guidelines, FCC guidelines, are not protective. In 2011, an NIH and Department of Energy study showed cell phones affect the blood glucose metabolism in the brain. The Department of Interior has said that the guidelines are 30 years out of date and no longer applicable as they do not protect wildlife. And recently, we heard about the National Toxicology Program. So our FCC guidelines continue to be a fraud and offer the telcos protection from liability. We know the Harvard report Dr. Merritt mentioned that our FCC is a captured agency, and this was from a report. You can find it online. They have the same playbook as the tobacco industry in all these different ways. And we also know that 11 international agreements are being violated by 5G, development of 5G. So And in addition, we know that there's an alternative to all of this antenna densification. We publish a report, Reinventing Wires, The Future of Landlines and Networks, authored by Dr. Sheckley, who's with us today, explaining how we need to create advanced communication systems that are fast, that are secure, that are, in fact, it was argued in this report from 13 different angles, not only one of which is health, but from 13 different angles. Each one of these reasons on their own is enough to say we should be using hardwired communications. So as I close, I want to just play this one video. This is, if we can, hold on a minute. This is, okay, there we go. This is Dr. Magda Havas from Trent University in Canada. She's measured the frequencies coming off of life, off of a plant. In this case, it's an aloe vera plant, and synthesized it so that you can hear it. These are the frequencies from nature that we were born into. And this is a frequency of a cell phone, my cell phone. So we have a choice. We need to stop the denial, become active, engaged. There's an urgent need to recreate a world founded on our values of respect for life, for others, for the environment, that embodies the hope that we can grow into our potential as a species and not cave to the pressures to be merged with machines or shaped and controlled by computer algorithms and harmed by man-made technologies. We need to exercise our rights and protect our democracy. So in closing, I'm going to say please support the radio frequency radiation activism, get involved locally, financially support the activist groups, the policy groups, and the legal efforts if you're able. There's significant resources are needed to educate widely on the RFR risks, to change the FCC exposure guidelines, to reverse a section of the Telecom Act of '96 that prevents your local governments from resisting these antennas on health or environmental grounds. We need to repeal laws in 25 states that are enabling wireless proliferation. We need to expose a massive accounting fraud that turns out there's a $500 billion to $1 trillion possibly accounting fraud that has been discovered, whereby they can show that 5G would not be sustainable on its own. They've been playing with the numbers, shifting the expenses from 5G into the landline balance or income statement, and so it's not directly related to the health effects, but it deserves everyone's support if possible, because it is going to show how corrupt this industry is and possibly be a windfall for individual states who will be able to recoup their funding. So we've done many policy reports, including the last one, Reinventing Wires. Dr. Sheckley, who you're going to hear from next, has done a report that may be relevant to other states. This is on Colorado, but shows how do you reclaim local control over cellular wireless facilities. And finally, we're hoping to do 2 more reports and are looking for support for them. One is on sustainability in telecommunications, and one is on this massive accounting scandal that's called deregulators. So thank you very much for being here, for your interest in the subject. Get involved, support your local groups, and